Assalamu alaikum. This is a course of macroeconomic theory, advanced approach, directed to fourth-year economic sections. Let's now solving some applications relating to the classical theory of interest rate. First, state whether the following statements are true or false. Number one, the autonomous reduction in investment demand has no effect on the aggregate demand according to the loanable fund theory. This statement is true. First of all, we have to remember that in the classical model, aggregate demand, which is demand side of the goods market, will not be affected by any change in autonomous investment, but it would be affected by money supply, assuming a given potential level of output and velocity of circulation. So according to the loanable fund theory, autonomous decline in investment is balanced by an equal increase in consumption and equal increase in induced investment. That's why any change in autonomous investments has no effect on the aggregate demand according to the classical thoughts. Let's now see how this happened graphically. In order to show the effect of reduction in autonomous investment on aggregate demand graphically, we have to remember that investment demand has two components. One is relating to the expected profitability of investment projects, which is autonomous investment, and the other part relates to interest rate, and we call it induced investment. Okay, here we start by a point of equilibrium, point A, in capital market, and we call it the loanable fund market. This point of equilibrium, it is intersection between the demand for investment or the investment curve and the supply for loanable fund, which represents the saving. First of all, when we have negative expectation about investment profitability, the autonomous investment would decline. This is shown graphically by shifting the investment curve from I0 to I1, and here we are moving from point A to a lower equilibrium point, which is point C, and the horizontal distance between the new and old investment curve represents the change or the decline in autonomous investment. This distance tells me that the aggregate demand would decrease by the horizontal distance between the old and the new investment curve. So the distance between I0 and I1, the horizontal distance, represents the decline in autonomous investment, and in the same case, aggregate demand would decrease by this distance, and the new interest rate in this case would be R1. In the short run, we are moving from point A to point D at the same interest rate. Okay, in a very short run, there wouldn't be any change in interest rate. Here we have a decline in autonomous investments, so there is a downward shift in investment curve, and we are moving from point A to point D. So the decline in autonomous investment would create excess supply for loanable fund. This excess supply of loanable fund would cause interest rate or nominal interest rate to reduce in order to restore the equilibrium in the capital market. The reduction in interest rate would cause two effects. First one, the consumption would increase and the saving would decrease. Second effect is that the induced investment would increase because the cost of borrowing decreased. This is shown graphically by distance A and distance B. Distance A, or the movement from point A to point C, it is the reduction in saving due to the reduction in interest rate. This reduction in saving is the same as increase in consumption. They are the same meaning. Reduction in saving equals increase in consumption. And the distance B means that it is movement from point D to point C. It is the increase in induced investment due to the reduction in the cost of borrowing from R0 to R1. The distance A plus B represents the increase in aggregate demand due to the reduction in investment. This increase in aggregate demand would cancel the initial decrease in aggregate demand due to the autonomous or the reduction in the autonomous investments. Okay, I'm gonna repeat this again. We are starting at point A. There would be a reduction in autonomous investment curve would shift from I0 to I1. This causes the equilibrium to decrease from point A to point C, and interest rate would decrease from R0 to R1. Here we're asking about the impact of this reduction in autonomous investment on the aggregate demand, whether the aggregate demand increased, decreased, or being constant. First of all, in a very short run, the aggregate demand would decrease as a result of a reduction in autonomous investment. The reduction in aggregate demand is measured by the horizontal distance between the old and the new investment curve, which is distance A plus distance B. But at the old interest rate, which is R0, there would be an excess supply for loanable fund. This excess supply of loanable fund would have to affect this induced investment to increase, and you are moving from point D to point C, which is the distance B, and this reduction in interest rate would cause a reduction in saving or an increase in consumption. So are moving from point A to point C. So the distance A represents the reduction in saving, distance B represents the increase in investment. So adding the two distance, we conclude that aggregate demand would increase by the distance A plus B. This increase in aggregate demand would cancel the initial reduction in aggregate demand due to the reduction in autonomous investment. That's why any change in investment would not have any effect on aggregate demand curve. Number 2, an increase in the government spending financed by selling bonds has no effect on the price level. This sentence is true, and we are going to see why this sentence is true. But I have to tell you that any change in aggregate demand will not have any effect on the potential level of employment, because the aggregate supply curve is vertical in the classical model, because we are producing at the potential level of output. So the only effect, if aggregate demand is increased, it has a pure effect on the price level. So when we are asking about the effect of government spending financed by selling bonds on the price level, here we are asking about the effect of government spending on the aggregate demand, because if there is an impact on aggregate demand, there would be an impact on the price level. If there is no any impact of the government spending or whatever the kind of spending, private investments or government investments, if the investment demand has no effect on the aggregate demand, it would have no effect on the price level. Let's see why. Again, starting at a point of equilibrium in capital market, point E, where the supply of loanable funds equals the demand for loanable funds. Now we assume that the governments tend to finance its budget deficit by selling bonds. This is shown graphically by shifting in the investment curve from I naught, it shifts upward to I1, and the point of equilibrium increased to point F. Okay, first of all, the horizontal distance between the old and new investment curve, which is measured by the distance ED, it represented the increase in investment demand, also increased in aggregate demand. So the initial increase in aggregate demand would be the distance ED. At the old interest rate R naught, with the increase in investment demand, this increase would create excess demand for loanable fund because the cost of borrowing is very low. This induced more demand for loanable fund. This excess demand, in order to get rid of it and restore equilibrium, the nominal interest rate should increase. When nominal interest rate increased, this has two effects. The increase in nominal interest rate would increase the saving or decrease the consumption. Also, it would decrease the induced investments. Okay, so the increase in interest rate would cause a reduction in induced investment, and this is shown graphically by moving from point D to point F, or from point D to point B. So the distance between point D and point B measure the reduction in induced investment due to the increase in interest rates. Okay, we are moving on the same investment or the new investment curve from one point to another point. And the distance between E and B, this distance represents the increase in saving due to the increase in interest rates. So the increase in saving, we can call it the decrease in consumption, plus the decrease in induced investments would cancel the initial increase in the investment demand, and the net effect of the selling of government bonds in order to finance the budget deficits on aggregate demand curve would be zero. There is no effect. In this case, when the aggregate demand does not change, the price level will not change. Number 3, inflation is a purely monetary phenomena for the classics. This sentence is true, because according to the quantity theory of money, MV equals BY, and we know that the level of output is constant. We are producing at full employment level of output, and the velocity of circulation is constant, so any change in quantity of money would be reflected by a change in the price level. So when the money supply increase, the price level would increase. by the same percentage. Any change in the quantity of money would result in a change in the price level in the same direction by the same percentage. That's why inflation is a purely monetary phenomenon for the classics.